The morning sun cast a golden glow on Cedarwood Avenue, a peaceful suburb where neighbors greeted each other with casual waves, and children played on tree-lined sidewalks. The tranquility, however, was shattered when Officer Daniel Brooks, a middle-aged cop with a reputation for being rough and abrasive, pulled his patrol car into the parking lot of a local grocery store. Inside the store, Leonard Mills, a quiet, elderly black man, leaned heavily on his worn, mahogany walking stick as he navigated the aisles. Dressed in a clean but modest suit, he moved with a careful deliberation. His graying beard and kind eyes made him seem approachable, though he seldom spoke to strangers unless prompted. He was a regular in the community, but largely kept to himself, tending to his small garden and occasionally mentoring neighborhood kids who needed guidance. As Leonard exited the store, balancing a single bag of groceries in one hand and his walking stick in the other, Officer Brooks spotted him from across the lot. Brooks' face twisted into a scowl. Over the years, he developed an unspoken animosity towards the elderly man. Perhaps it was rooted in Leonard's quiet dignity, which Brooks misinterpreted as defiance. Whatever the reason, today was the day his misplaced resentment boiled over. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Brooks barked, slamming his car door shut and marching toward Leonard. Leonard paused, tilting his head slightly in confusion, but remaining calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" His voice was steady, though tinged with weariness. "You people think you can get away with anything," Brooks spat, not bothering to elaborate. Before Leonard could respond, Brooks grabbed the walking stick out of his hand. "This isn't yours," Brooks declared, examining the polished wood as if searching for a reason to justify his accusation. "Looks too fancy for someone like you. Where'd you steal it from?" The surrounding shoppers stopped in their tracks, their whispers mixing with the hum of passing cars. "That's my stick," Leonard replied, his tone measured. "It was a gift from my late wife. If you'll kindly return it, I'll be on my way." But Brooks wasn't listening. He jabbed the stick into Leonard's side, causing him to stumble. "You think you can talk back to me?" Brooks sneered, raising the stick as if to strike. Before the blow could land, a voice rang out. "Daniel!" It was the store manager, a wiry man named Rick, rushing out of the store with his hands raised. "What are you doing? This man hasn't done anything wrong." Brooks waved him off with a dismissive grunt, but the interruption gave Leonard a chance to steady himself. The elderly man's eyes, now sharp and unwavering, locked onto Brooks. "Do you have any idea who you're messing with?" Leonard said quietly, his words laced with a calm authority that made Brooks hesitate for the first time. But the moment passed quickly, and Brooks scoffed. "Oh, really? And who are you supposed to be? Some big shot?" Leonard didn't answer. He simply adjusted his tie, picked up his grocery bag, and began walking away. "You'll find out soon enough," he said over his shoulder. Brooks stood there fuming, but as the onlookers murmured among themselves, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He didn't know it yet, but his actions had set in motion a chain of events that would unravel his life in ways he couldn't imagine. The day after the incident, the video taken by a bystander began circulating online. Within hours, it had amassed thousands of views and an outpouring of outrage. The clip showed Officer Brooks striking Leonard's side with the walking stick, followed by Leonard's dignified response. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForLeonard, while local news stations began covering the story. Meanwhile, Leonard sat in the modest living room of his small bungalow, sipping tea and scrolling through messages on his phone. His niece, Angela, had alerted him to the growing attention. She sat across from him, her face a mix of worry and determination. "Uncle Leo, this is getting serious," she said, setting her laptop on the coffee table. "People are furious. Activists are organizing protests. You need to do something, hold a press conference or something. Speak out." Leonard shook his head, his expression calm but resolute. "The truth will come out when it needs to," he replied. "I've dealt with men like Brooks before. They're loud, but their arrogance is their undoing." Angela leaned back, frustrated, but trusting her uncle's judgment. She knew him as a man of patience and quiet power, a far cry from the retired life he had chosen to live. As the media frenzy intensified, Officer Brooks carried on with his usual routine, dismissing the uproar as temporary noise. He laughed with his colleagues at the station, confident that the department would protect him as they always had. His supervisor, Captain Mason, pulled him aside once to issue a half-hearted warning. "Keep your head down for a bit, Brooks. This'll blow over like it always does." Brooks smirked, unconcerned. "Sure thing, Cap. People love to get riled up over nothing." But his confidence began to waver a few days later when a letter arrived at the station addressed to him. Inside was an official summons from the court, accompanied by a brief note on thick, embossed stationery. The words were simple but chilling. "See you in court, Lem." At first, Brooks dismissed it as a prank, but the following morning, Leonard Mills appeared on the front page of the city's most prominent newspaper, the Herald-Times. The article detailed Leonard's illustrious past as one of the most feared and respected civil rights attorneys in the country. He had spent decades taking on cases of police misconduct, corporate discrimination, and systemic injustice, and winning. Retired for nearly 10 years, Leonard had stepped back from the limelight after losing his wife, Margaret. His grief had driven him to seek a quieter life, away from the courtroom and the battles that had once defined him. But now, it seemed, the warrior in him had been reawakened. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Protesters outside the police station held up signs reading, "Know who you're messing with," and "Justice for Mills." Reporters swarmed Leonard's house, though he politely declined interviews. Brooks, on the other hand, was growing increasingly paranoid. The department's usual assurances felt hollow, now that Leonard's reputation had come to light. He began avoiding calls from reporters and dodging questions from colleagues. Meanwhile, Leonard prepared for his case with methodical precision. In his home office, he pored over files and legal briefs, occasionally stopping to jot down notes on a yellow legal pad. Angela assisted him, handling emails and researching precedents. "You're really going to take him down, aren't you?" she asked one evening. Leonard looked up from his work, his eyes steady. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about accountability. Men like Brooks think they're above the law. They need to learn that justice doesn't discriminate." Across town, Brooks sat in his dimly lit apartment, nursing a bottle of beer and replaying the video of the incident on his phone. The look in Leonard's eyes haunted him, the calm defiance, the quiet promise of retribution. For the first time in his career, Brooks felt truly vulnerable. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Leonard's presence seemed to loom over everything. Community leaders rallied around him, organizing events and fundraisers to support his cause. Old colleagues and former clients came out of the woodwork, sharing stories of how Leonard had changed their lives. One of them was John Herrera, a local shop owner whose business Leonard had saved from bankruptcy years ago. "Mr. Mills doesn't back down," John told a group of reporters. "He's the kind of man who fights for what's right, no matter the odds." Even Leonard's neighbors, who had only known him as the quiet man with the garden, began to see him in a new light. "He's always been kind, but I had no idea he was such a powerhouse," said Mrs. Graham, who lived next door. As the trial date approached, the tension in the air was palpable. Leonard remained composed, his every action deliberate and measured. He was a man on a mission, and nothing not Brooks' attempts to smear his character, nor the police department's attempts to settle quietly, would deter him. The trial began in a packed courtroom, with journalists crammed into every available space and protesters gathered outside. Leonard Mills, dressed in a crisp navy suit, walked into the room with the same calm confidence that had unnerved Officer Brooks on that fateful day. Behind him sat Angela, her presence a quiet reassurance, and several community members who had come to support him. Officer Daniel Brooks, by contrast, looked uneasy. His lawyer, Jack Stanton, a man known for defending officers in misconduct cases, whispered hurried instructions to him, but Brooks' eyes kept darting toward Leonard. He tried to mask his discomfort with a smirk, but the weight of the moment hung heavy on him. The prosecution's opening statement was concise but damning. They painted Brooks as a man who abused his authority, citing not only the incident with Leonard, but also a history of complaints against him that had been quietly dismissed by the department. Leonard's attorney, a sharp and eloquent woman named Patricia Evans, emphasized the larger implications of the case. "This is not just about an officer attacking an innocent man," she said, her voice steady and clear. "This is about holding those in power accountable for their actions and ensuring that justice is not a privilege, but a right for everyone." Brooks' defense, on the other hand, hinged on portraying the incident as a misunderstanding. "Officer Brooks acted in good faith," Stanton argued. "He believed the walking stick was stolen property and was simply doing his job. Any force used was minimal and necessary to maintain order." The first day of testimony was dominated by bystanders who had witnessed the incident. The grocery store manager, Rick, recounted how Brooks had aggressively confronted Leonard without cause. "I tried to step in," Rick said, glancing nervously at Brooks, "but he wouldn't listen. It was like he'd already decided Mr. Mills was guilty of something, even though he wasn't doing anything wrong." Several others corroborated Rick's account, describing how Brooks had taken the walking stick and jabbed Leonard with it. The prosecution played the now viral video of the incident, which elicited audible gasps from the courtroom. When Leonard took the stand, the atmosphere shifted. His calm demeanor and articulate responses commanded the room's attention. He described the incident in detail, but when asked how it had affected him, he paused. "I've faced men like Officer Brooks before," he said, his voice tinged with both weariness and resolve. "Men who think their badge gives them the right to humiliate and harm others. But I refuse to be a victim. This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring no one else has to endure what I did." Brooks, visibly uncomfortable, avoided Leonard's gaze. The defense called Brooks to the stand next. His testimony was riddled with contradictions. He claimed Leonard had been acting suspiciously and had resisted when he tried to question him. But under cross-examination, Patricia Evans dismantled his narrative. "Officer Brooks," she said, her tone sharp but controlled, "can you explain why you assumed Mr. Mills had stolen the walking stick, despite having no evidence to support that claim?" Brooks stammered, struggling to come up with an answer. It just didn't seem like it belonged to him," he finally muttered. Evans seized the moment. "So your assumption was based on what, exactly? His appearance? The color of his skin?" The courtroom fell silent. Brooks' face turned red, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. By the third day of the trial, it was clear that Brooks' defense was unraveling. The prosecution introduced evidence of prior complaints against him, including incidents of excessive force and racially charged remarks. Though these cases had been dismissed or quietly settled, they painted a damning picture of a man who had repeatedly abused his authority. As the trial progressed, Leonard's unwavering composure became a focal point for the media. Articles praised his dignity and determination, drawing comparisons to civil rights icons of the past. Protesters outside the courthouse carried signs that read, "Justice for Leonard and accountability now." Inside, tensions reached a boiling point during the closing arguments. Patricia Evans delivered a powerful speech, highlighting the systemic issues that allowed officers like Brooks to go unchecked. "This case is not just about Officer Brooks," she said. "It's about a system that protects individuals like him while failing the very communities they are meant to serve. Today, we have an opportunity to change that." When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Brooks sat stiffly in his chair, his usual bravado replaced by visible anxiety. Leonard, meanwhile, remained calm, his hands folded neatly on the table in front of him. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom was electric with tension as the judge prepared to read the jury's verdict. Leonard sat motionless, his face calm, but his posture firm. Officer Brooks, in stark contrast, fidgeted nervously, his lawyer whispering hurried reassurances that seemed to fall on deaf ears. The foreperson of the jury stood and addressed the court. "In the matter of Officer Daniel Brooks versus the people, we find the defendant," she paused, the weight of the moment palpable, "guilty of misconduct, excessive force, and abuse of authority." A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by murmurs of approval and disbelief. Brooks' face drained of color, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the words. But the case was far from over. The verdict had opened a Pandora's box, revealing systemic flaws in the police department that extended far beyond Brooks. As reporters swarmed outside the courthouse, Digging into past cases and internal documents, a troubling pattern emerged. It became clear that Brooks was not an anomaly, but a symptom of a larger issue, a department that had repeatedly ignored or covered up complaints of misconduct. This revelation added another layer of complexity to the story. While the community celebrated Leonard's victory, activists and community leaders began calling for broader reform. Protests grew in size, shifting their focus from a single officer to the entire police department. Chants of justice for Leonard were replaced with cries of justice for all. Meanwhile, Leonard's personal life faced its own set of challenges. Angela, who had been his rock throughout the trial, began to feel the strain of her newfound role. Balancing her job as a social worker with assisting her uncle left her exhausted, and she often found herself grappling with feelings of inadequacy. "I feel like I'm barely keeping up," she admitted to Leonard one evening as they sat in his living room. Leonard placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You've done more than I could have ever asked for," he said. "But this fight doesn't rest solely on your shoulders or mine. Change takes a collective effort." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Standing on the porch was John Herrera, the shop owner Leonard had helped years ago. Behind him were several others from the community, each carrying plates of food and supplies. "We wanted to thank you," John said, his voice earnest, "for standing up when so many of us couldn't. You've inspired us, Mr. Mills." The small group stayed late into the night, sharing stories and laughter. For the first time in weeks, Leonard allowed himself to relax, his heart warmed by the outpouring of support. Back at the police department, chaos was unfolding. The guilty verdict had emboldened whistleblowers within the force, leading to a series of damning leaks. Confidential memos, emails, and internal reports revealed a culture of corruption and cover-ups that implicated high-ranking officials. Captain Mason, who had assured Brooks the controversy would blow over, found himself at the center of a growing scandal. In a desperate attempt to save face, the department announced sweeping reforms, including the resignation of several senior officers and the implementation of mandatory bias training. But for many in the community, these measures felt like too little, too late. For Brooks, the fallout was even more severe. Stripped of his badge and facing civil lawsuits from multiple victims, he became a pariah. His once loyal colleagues distanced themselves, eager to avoid association with his disgraced name. Desperate and humiliated, Brooks attempted to reach out to Leonard. One evening, he showed up unannounced at Leonard's house, his demeanor a shadow of the arrogance he once exuded. I wanted to say I'm sorry," Brooks stammered, his voice cracking. "I made a mistake, and I let my anger get the better of me." Leonard regarded him with a measured gaze. "An apology is a start," he said after a long pause. "But it doesn't erase the harm you've caused, not just to me, but to others as well." Brooks nodded, his eyes downcast. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't know what else to do." Leonard's voice softened slightly. "If you truly want to make amends, then use whatever time you have left to help change the system you are part of. It won't undo the past, but it's a step toward redemption." The incident also prompted Leonard to reflect on his own future. While he had retired from law years ago, the trial reignited a fire within him. Encouraged by Angela and others in the community, he began holding workshops on civil rights and legal advocacy, empowering others to stand up for themselves and their neighbors. The story of Leonard Mills versus Daniel Brooks became a turning point for Cedarwood Avenue and beyond. It sparked difficult but necessary conversations about accountability, privilege, and the power of resilience. As weeks passed, Leonard Mills became a symbol of resilience and justice, his story reverberating far beyond Cedarwood Avenue. His workshops on civil rights advocacy attracted attendees from neighboring cities, transforming his quiet bungalow into a hub of activism. But beneath the surface, Leonard sensed a brewing storm of reaction to the change he and the community were fostering. One afternoon, Angela rushed into the house, her phone in hand and her face pale. "Uncle Leo," she said, her voice shaking, "they've started a smear campaign against you." Leonard set down the legal brief he had been reviewing. "Who's they?" he asked calmly. Angela handed him the phone. On the screen was a breaking news segment featuring a panel of commentators dissecting Leonard's past. A conservative commentator claimed Leonard had used unethical tactics in some of his earlier cases, citing vague, unsubstantiated allegations. Social media was abuzz with accusations, ranging from financial impropriety to fabricated connections to extremist groups. "It's the police union," Angela said. "They're trying to discredit you to save their reputation. They're scared." Leonard leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Fear makes people desperate," he said after a moment. "But the truth doesn't fear the light." Despite his confidence, the attacks began taking a toll. Protesters who had once chanted his name now included a vocal minority questioning his integrity. Local news stations aired debates about whether Leonard's past victories had been earned or manipulated. Even some of his allies started to distance themselves, fearing association with controversy. The pressure came to a head when Leonard received a subpoena to testify before a hastily convened city council hearing. The police union had leveraged their influence to initiate an investigation into his past cases, accusing him of exploiting legal loopholes and manipulating evidence. Angela was furious. "This is ridiculous. They're dragging you through the mud because they're scared of losing their power." Leonard placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They're trying to distract us," he said, "but we'll stay focused on the truth." The hearing was a spectacle. The council chamber was packed with reporters, community members, and activists on both sides of the divide. Leonard sat at the witness table, his posture as composed as ever, while the police union's attorney, a combative man named Charles Redding, paced in front of him. "Mr. Mills," Redding began, his tone dripping with condescension, "you've built quite the reputation as a champion of justice. But isn't it true that in 1993, you suppressed evidence in the Patterson case to secure a favorable verdict?" Leonard's gaze remained steady. "That accusation was investigated and dismissed over 30 years ago," he replied. "The evidence in question was ruled inadmissible because it was obtained illegally." "I acted within the bounds of the law," Redding smirked. "Convenient, isn't it? The law works in your favor when it suits you." The crowd murmured, but Leonard remained unfazed. "The law doesn't serve me," he said. "It serves justice. If it's applied unevenly, that's not the fault of those who demand accountability. It's the fault of those who abuse it." The exchange set the tone for the hearing. Redding hurled accusation after accusation, but Leonard dismantled each one with clarity and precision. His composure under fire earned him renewed respect from many in the audience, including some who had begun to doubt him. The turning point came unexpectedly. During a recess, Angela noticed a familiar face in the crowd, a retired detective named Henry Cole, who had been part of Sid Arwood's police force during Leonard's most high-profile cases. Cole was known for his integrity, a rarity in a department often mired in controversy. Angela approached him hesitantly. "Detective Cole? I didn't expect to see you here." Cole nodded grimly. "I couldn't stay silent anymore," he said. When the hearing resumed, Cole took the stand as a surprise witness. His testimony was explosive. He revealed that the police union had pressured him and others to fabricate complaints against Leonard during his legal career, fearing his ability to expose corruption within the department. "They saw him as a threat," Cole said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "And they were right. Leonard Mills stood for justice when the system didn't, and they hated him for it." The revelation sent shockwaves through the chamber. Reporters scrambled to file updates, and social media erupted with support for Leonard. The police union's smear campaign crumbled under the weight of Cole's testimony, exposing their desperation and further galvanizing the movement for accountability. That evening, Leonard and Angela returned home to find their front yard filled with supporters holding candles and signs. The crowd erupted into cheers as Leonard stepped onto the porch, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I've spent my life fighting for justice," he told them, "and I will continue to do so, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Together, we can create a system that serves everyone, not just the privileged few." The crowd roared its approval, their collective resolve stronger than ever. The fallout from the city council hearing was immediate and far-reaching. The police union, once seen as an untouchable force in Cedarwood, faced mounting scrutiny. National media outlets picked up the story, framing it as a watershed moment in the fight against systemic corruption. A union's leadership scrambled to perform damage control, but the revelations from Detective Cole had ignited a fire they couldn't extinguish. The mayor, under pressure from activists and public outcry, announced a full independent audit of the police department's practices. Civil rights organizations pledged legal support for victims of past misconduct, and a grassroots campaign began collecting signatures to establish a civilian oversight board. For Officer Daniel Brooks, the consequences were personal and unrelenting. Stripped of his badge and unable to find work in law enforcement, he became a symbol of what happens when power is abused. His public apology, hastily written and poorly delivered, did little to garner sympathy. Meanwhile, Leonard's life underwent a transformation. Angela took on an active role in organizing his workshops, which had grown into a citywide initiative. They began partnering with local schools, community centers, and even small businesses to educate people on their rights and the importance of civic engagement. Leonard's home office became a bustling hub of activity, with volunteers constantly coming and going. But as his public profile grew, so did the challenges. Late one night, Leonard received a call from Patricia Evans, the attorney who had represented him in the trial. "Leonard," she began, her tone serious, "I've been reviewing some troubling messages. I think you need to see this." The next morning, Patricia arrived with a folder containing copies of emails, anonymous threats, and social media posts. Many were vague but unsettling, referencing Leonard's past cases and his recent victory over Brooks. "They're trying to intimidate you," Patricia said, her expression grave. "It's not unusual in cases like this, but it's escalating. Have you considered hiring security?" Leonard shook his head. "I won't live in fear," he said firmly. "If they think they can scare me into silence, they've underestimated the strength of this community." Despite his resolve, Angela insisted on installing security cameras around the house. She also reached out to local activists, who organized a rotating schedule to ensure Leonard was never alone during public events. The tension reached a boiling point one fateful evening. Leonard was attending a town hall meeting hosted by the mayor to discuss proposed police reforms. The atmosphere was tense, with officers, community members, and activists filling the room. While most participants spoke passionately but respectfully, a small group of police supporters heckled and jeered at every mention of change. When Leonard approached the microphone to share his thoughts, the room fell silent. "I'm not here to vilify anyone," he began. "I'm here to advocate for accountability. Reform is not an attack on good officers. It's a shield against bad ones. It's a chance to rebuild trust and create a system that serves all of us equally." The crowd erupted into applause, but the pockets of resistance grew louder, shouting accusations and insults. One man stood and pointed directly at Leonard. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he sneered. "You're nothing but a troublemaker, stirring up hate against people who put their lives on the line." Leonard turned toward him, his expression calm. "I respect those who serve with honor," he said. "But respect is earned through integrity, not demanded through fear." The exchange was recorded and shared widely, earning Leonard praise for his composure. But it also further inflamed his detractors. That night, Leonard's home was vandalized. Angela arrived early the next morning to find graffiti scrawled across the front fence. "Go back where you came from." Windows were smashed, and the garden Leonard had meticulously cared for was trampled. For a moment, Angela feared this might break him. But when Leonard stepped outside, his expression was not one of defeat, but determination. "We'll clean it up," he said simply, rolling up his sleeves. Within hours, neighbors arrived with supplies, paint, and tools. By the end of the day, the fence was repaired, the windows boarded, and the garden replanted. The act of defiance brought the community closer together, reinforcing their shared commitment to justice. The consequences of Leonard's actions continued to ripple outward. The police department underwent sweeping changes, with several officers resigning or being terminated for their roles in past misconduct. The establishment of the Civilian Oversight Board marked a significant victory, giving residents a voice in shaping public safety policies. Leonard's workshops expanded into a regional initiative, inspiring similar efforts in neighboring cities. His name became synonymous with resilience, and his story was used as a case study in universities and legal seminars. Yet, through it all, Leonard remained humble. "This isn't about me," he often said. "It's about what we can accomplish together. Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey." Leonard Mills' journey had become a beacon of hope and a rallying cry for change. Despite the hardships he faced, his resolve only strengthened. His work transcended the personal grievances against Officer Brooks, evolving into a larger crusade for justice and reform. But this new chapter of his life brought challenges that tested his character and resilience like never before. The weight of leadership. As Leonard's profile grew, so did the demands on his time and energy. His calendar filled with speaking engagements, legal consultations, and workshops. Activists from across the country reached out, seeking guidance and inspiration. Though he was honored by the recognition, Leonard began to feel the weight of his responsibilities. "You're spreading yourself too thin," Angela warned one evening as she organized his paperwork. "You can't take on every battle, Uncle Leo. You need to prioritize." Leonard sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know you're right," he admitted, "but how do I choose which fight to take on? Every case, every story matters. How do I tell someone their struggle isn't important enough?" Angela placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've already done so much. Empower others to lead. You don't have to do this alone." Taking her advice to heart, Leonard began mentoring a new generation of activists and legal advocates. He shared his knowledge, teaching them not only the intricacies of law, but also the importance of empathy and persistence. Among his mentees was a young attorney named Maya Cruz, whose fiery passion reminded Leonard of his younger self. Maya quickly became a rising star in Leonard's circle, taking on cases with tenacity and a sharp legal mind. Under his guidance, she successfully challenged discriminatory housing policies in Cedarwood, earning her the respect of the community. Leonard saw in her the potential to carry on his legacy, and for the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of relief. Personal challenges. Amid his professional triumphs, Leonard grappled with personal struggles. His peaceful home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a battleground after the vandalism incident. Though the community had rallied to repair the damage, the sense of safety he once felt was gone. Angela noticed the change in him. "You've been avoiding the garden," she said one day as they sat on the porch. "You used to spend hours out there. What's stopping you now?" Leonard looked out at the freshly planted flowers, their colors vibrant against the backdrop of the setting sun. "It's not the same," he said quietly. "Every time I look at it, I see what they tried to take away. It's a reminder of how fragile peace can be." Angela smiled gently. "Maybe it's also a reminder of how we can rebuild. They tried to destroy something beautiful, but look, it's still here, stronger than ever. Just like you." Her words struck a chord. That weekend, Leonard donned his gardening gloves and returned to the soil, finding solace in the simple act of nurturing life. The garden flourished under his care, becoming a symbol of resilience for the neighborhood. Confronting fear, the threats against Leonard didn't stop. Anonymous letters and emails continued to trickle in, some more menacing than others. But Leonard refused to let fear dictate his actions. When the local police department offered increased surveillance, he declined. "Protection shouldn't come at the cost of freedom," he said. "I won't live my life looking over my shoulder." Instead, he channeled his fear into action. Leonard began working with a coalition of activists and legislators to draft a bill addressing police accountability and misconduct. The bill, known as the Mills Reform Act, proposed stricter oversight of law enforcement agencies and harsher penalties for officers found guilty of abuse. The process was arduous, with intense opposition from police unions and conservative lawmakers. But Leonard remained steadfast, attending hearings and lobbying for support. One pivotal moment came during a televised debate with a vocal opponent of the bill, Senator Richard Hargrove. The senator argued that the reforms were anti-police and would undermine public safety. Leonard countered with his characteristic calm. "This isn't about being anti-police," he said. It's about being pro-justice. Accountability isn't a punishment, it's a promise. A promise that the law applies equally to all, no matter who wears the badge. His words resonated with viewers, sparking a wave of public support for the bill. A new chapter of the Mills Reform Act passed narrowly in the state legislature, marking a monumental victory for Leonard and his allies. The moment was bittersweet, as Leonard knew the road ahead would still be long and difficult. But as he stood on the steps of the state capitol, addressing a jubilant crowd, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. "This is just the beginning," he told them. "True change takes time, but every step forward brings us closer to the world we want to see. Stay vigilant, stay united, and never stop fighting for what's right." That night, Leonard returned home to find his garden illuminated by strings of lights, placed there by Angela and the neighborhood kids. In the center was a new plaque that read, "Justice grows here." Leonard knelt by the plaque, running his fingers over the engraved words. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to smile, not just a fleeting grin, but a genuine expression of hope and peace. The months following the passage of the Mills Reform Act were a whirlwind of activity. Leonard Mills' name became a symbol of hope and accountability, attracting praise from civil rights leaders and scrutiny from powerful detractors. While his workshops and advocacy initiatives expanded into a statewide movement, resistance to his work also intensified. Behind closed doors, influential figures within law enforcement and politics began conspiring to undermine Leonard's progress. Their methods ranged from disinformation campaigns to subtle but damaging interference with his projects. Angela noticed the increasing strain on her uncle as he juggled the mounting pressure. "You need to take a break, Uncle Leo," she said one evening as he pored over a stack of documents. He gave her a tired smile. "I'll rest when the work is done." Angela crossed her arms. "The work will never be done if you burn yourself out. You've taught me that this isn't a sprint, it's a marathon." Her words lingered with Leonard, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something big was looming on the horizon. The police union's countermove. The tipping point came when the police union filed a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the Mills Reform Act. The union's legal team, bolstered by high-profile attorneys, argued that the reforms infringed on officers' rights and threatened public safety. The case quickly gained national attention, polarizing public opinion and reigniting tensions in Cedarwood and beyond. "This isn't just a legal battle," Leonard told Angela and Maya Cruz during a late-night strategy meeting. "It's a test of whether we can hold the system accountable or if it will continue to protect itself at the expense of justice." Maya nodded, her resolve unwavering. "Then we'll fight like hell to defend this law. It's not just about us, it's about everyone who's been silenced by this system." As the case moved toward a climactic hearing before the state Supreme Court, Leonard and his team prepared meticulously. They reviewed every clause of the act, gathered testimonies from experts and victims of police misconduct, and countered the union's arguments with precision. But the stakes were higher than ever. Opponents of the act launched an aggressive smear campaign against Leonard, dredging up old controversies and spreading misinformation about his motives. One particularly scathing editorial accused him of dividing the community and endangering law enforcement. Angela read the article aloud during a meeting, her voice trembling with frustration. "They're desperate," Leonard said, his tone steady, "and desperation leads to mistakes. Let's focus on the facts. They'll speak louder than fear-mongering." The final push. The night before the hearing, Leonard received an anonymous tip from a whistleblower within the police union. The tip included internal emails revealing that the union's legal team had fabricated evidence to support their case. "This could change everything," Angela said, her eyes wide as she read through the documents. "It's risky," Maya warned. "If we present this without corroboration, it could backfire." Leonard considered their words carefully. "Truth has always been our strongest weapon," he said finally. "We'll verify it, and if it's legitimate, we'll use it." The next morning, as Leonard entered the courtroom, he felt the weight of the moment. The packed chamber buzzed with anticipation, the air charged with tension. The state Supreme Court justices filed in, their expressions impassive as they prepared to hear arguments that could reshape the future of law enforcement accountability. The hearing, the union's lead attorney, Charles Redding, delivered a fiery opening argument, painting the Mills Reform Act as an overreach that jeopardized officers' ability to perform their duties. He cited carefully curated statistics and appealed to the justice's sense of public safety. But when it was Leonard's turn to speak, he dismantled Redding's arguments with methodical precision. The Mills Reform Act does not weaken law enforcement, he said, his voice firm but calm. It strengthens it by ensuring that those who abuse their authority are held accountable. Accountability is not an attack on integrity. It is the foundation of it. As the hearing continued, Leonard's team presented testimony from experts, community leaders, and victims of police misconduct. They ended with the bombshell evidence from the whistleblower, which had been verified overnight. The emails, projected onto a screen for all to see, exposed the union's attempt to manipulate the court. The revelation caused an uproar in the courtroom. The justices called for an immediate recess, leaving the room in chaos as reporters scrambled to capture the moment. The decision approaches as Leonard stepped outside the courthouse during the recess. He was met with a crowd of supporters, holding signs and chanting his name. Angela and Maya stood by his side, their faces reflecting a mix of exhaustion and hope. "Whatever happens in there," Leonard said, looking out at the crowd, "this fight isn't over." Change doesn't come from a single law or ruling. It comes from people refusing to accept injustice. The courtroom was packed once again as the state Supreme Court reconvened to hear final arguments. The atmosphere was tense, the stakes clear to everyone present. The justices filed in, their faces unreadable, and the proceedings resumed. The union's attorney, Charles Redding, was visibly shaken as he attempted to address the whistleblower evidence. "These emails do not represent the actions of the entire police union," he argued, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "They are the actions of a few individuals who have been reprimanded internally." Patricia Evans, representing Leonard's side, was quick to respond. The union's attempt to downplay this evidence only underscores the need for reform. These actions were not isolated. They are part of a larger pattern of obstruction and abuse that the Mills Reform Act seeks to address. Leonard's closing words. As the hearing drew to a close, Leonard was given the opportunity to deliver a final statement. Rising from his seat, he approached the podium, his calm demeanor masking the intensity of his conviction. "Your Honors," he began, his voice steady, "this case is about more than a law. It is about the soul of our justice system and the values we claim to uphold. Accountability is not an inconvenience. It is the cornerstone of trust between the governed and those who govern." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, every eye on him. For too long, communities like mine have borne the weight of a system that protects its own at the expense of justice. The Mills Reform Act is not perfect, but it is a necessary step toward ensuring that the law applies equally to all. We owe it to the victims, to the officers who serve with integrity, and to future generations to set a precedent that justice is not a privilege, but a right. As Leonard returned to his seat, the room erupted in applause, despite the judge's attempts to restore order. Even the justices appeared moved, though they quickly masked their emotions. The waiting game, the justices retired to deliberate, leaving the courtroom buzzing with anticipation. Leonard and his team waited in a nearby room, joined by Angela, Maya, and a few close supporters. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. "Whatever happens, we've done everything we could," Maya said, her voice resolute. Leonard nodded. "And that's all anyone can ask." Finally, the court clerk appeared, summoning everyone back to the courtroom. As Leonard walked through the doors, the crowd outside erupted into cheers, their chants of "justice for all" echoing through the halls. The verdict, the Chief Justice, an elderly woman with a reputation for impartiality, read the decision aloud. After careful deliberation, this court finds that the Mills Reform Act is constitutional and necessary for the preservation of justice and accountability within our state. The room erupted into applause, tears streaming down the faces of many in attendance. Angela grabbed Leonard's hand, squeezing it tightly as Maya let out a triumphant cheer. Outside, the news spread like wildfire. Supporters gathered in the streets, celebrating the landmark decision. Reporters clamored for statements, and social media lit up with messages of hope and solidarity. Brooks' reckoning. The decision also marked the final nail in the coffin for Officer Daniel Brooks. Already disgraced, the ruling led to the reopening of several cases involving his misconduct. Brooks eventually faced criminal charges for his past actions, including excessive force and falsifying reports. He issued a statement from his lawyer, expressing regret for his actions and acknowledging Leonard's role in bringing him to justice. But for Leonard, the matter was no longer personal. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when people refused to accept injustice. A new era. The victory was more than just a legal triumph. It sparked a wave of similar reforms across the country, with activists and lawmakers using the Mills Reform Act as a blueprint for change. Leonard's workshops expanded into a national initiative, empowering communities to demand accountability and advocate for justice. That evening, Leonard returned home to find his garden once again filled with supporters. This time, the gathering was not to repair damage, but to celebrate growth. Children played among the flowers, their laughter a testament to the hope that had taken root. As Leonard stood on the porch, Angela handed him a microphone. "They're waiting for you," she said with a smile. Leonard stepped forward, his heart full. "This victory belongs to all of us," he told the crowd. "It proves that when we stand together, we can achieve the impossible. But this is not the end. It is the beginning of a brighter, fairer future. Let us continue to grow, to learn, and to fight for justice." The crowd erupted into cheers, their unity a powerful force for change. Leonard Mills stood at the center of a movement that had transcended its origins. The Mills Reform Act, once a contentious local policy, became a blueprint for national reform. State after state adopted similar measures, leading to the establishment of oversight boards, transparent investigation protocols, and stricter penalties for abuse of power. Though Leonard's name became synonymous with justice and resilience, he remained humble. He saw himself not as a hero, but as one piece of a much larger puzzle. The ripple effect. The victory inspired a new generation of leaders and activists. Maya Cruz, Leonard's mentee, became a prominent figure in the movement, tackling issues of housing, education, and criminal justice with the same passion Leonard had instilled in her. Angela, bolstered by her uncle's guidance, expanded her role as a social worker, launching programs to support underprivileged youth and families in Cedarwood. Meanwhile, Leonard continued his workshops, though he took Angela's advice and began scaling back his commitments. He chose his battles carefully, empowering others to carry the torch. "The work doesn't stop with me," he often said. "It thrives in the hands of those who believe in it." Personal growth. For Leonard, the journey was not without its personal rewards. The garden he once saw as a symbol of destruction now flourished, a vibrant reflection of his life's work. He spent mornings tending to it, finding solace in the simplicity of planting and pruning. One day, while sitting on his porch, he received an unexpected visitor. Detective Henry Cole, the retired officer who had testified on Leonard's behalf during the hearing, arrived with a small sapling in hand. "I thought this might fit in your garden," Cole said, handing Leonard the young tree. Leonard smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Henry. It means a lot." Cole nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know, you didn't just change the community. You changed me. I used to think the system was unfixable, that it was easier to look the other way. But you proved that change is possible, even when it seems impossible." As they planted the tree together, Leonard felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The sapling, like the movement he had helped grow, was a testament to what could be achieved with patience, courage, and unity. Months later, Leonard was invited to speak at a national civil rights conference. As he stepped onto the stage, the audience rose to their feet, their applause a thunderous acknowledgement of his contributions. Standing at the podium, Leonard took a moment to absorb the energy of the room. He thought of Margaret, his late wife, whose memory had been his guiding light throughout his journey. "Change is never easy," he began, his voice resonating with quiet strength. "It requires sacrifice, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But the reward is a future where justice is not an ideal, but a reality. That is a future worth fighting for. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing long after Leonard left the stage. As the years went by, Leonard's name became etched in history books, his story told in classrooms and documentaries. But for those who knew him personally, he remained Leonard, the man who tended his garden, mentored his community, and stood unwavering in the face of adversity. His legacy was not just in the laws he helped create or the movements he inspired, but in the countless lives he touched. And as the sapling in his garden grew into a towering tree, it stood as a living symbol of his impact, a reminder that justice, like a tree, requires strong roots and constant care. Years later, a young boy walked past Leonard's garden with his mother. Stopping to admire the towering tree, he asked, "Who planted that?" His mother smiled. "A man named Leonard Mills. He stood up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. Because of him, the world is a little better today." The boy looked up at the tree, its branches reaching toward the sky. "I want to be like him when I grow up," he said. And in that moment, Leonard's legacy lived on. Leonard's story reminds us that change begins with courage and grows through collective action. What will you do to stand up for justice in your own community? Share this story, reflect on its lessons, and remember that every step toward fairness and equality makes a difference. Was this conclusion and epilogue satisfactory? Would you like to add any details? Or shall we finalize the story?